not supposed to announce myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I signed up. Hopefully, it's
Working hard over here, girl. Oh, you videotape?
No, I'm streaming. I'm streaming this.
Nice.
Please don't. Only because when it vibrates, it's going to set this off. Yes, please.
Did you ever?
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Did you ever do anything with the stars?
What's that?
Did you ever do anything like with the stars, like any study on the stars?
Well, my focus was not astronomy. I was complex systems, which was a different field. I'm going to talk about astronomy.
Well, I remember I saw a program with a guy who looked similar like you. That he did like a thing about prophecies and the stars or whatever.
That wasn't me.
Okay.
I was on TVN once talking about the Shroud of Turin.
Okay.
I usually don't do Christian TV though.
Yeah.
So.
no, that's what
I missed it. What I missed? I just know. I just saw. Actually, I saw him at we talked about it. The station. Yeah, last year Easter. Yeah, so typically it's like they keep to 3D image of Jesus on Shroud. So crazy. I wonder if you can tell us what it looks like now. I never noticed. What? Oh, you are, listen, woman, the wrong business.
At Joe's line.
I just salon. Pedicure daddy.
Sofa with the referrals, we're like,
Oh my gosh.
Is that your coat? Is it your coat?
She's so fancy. Honey, you should be in the fashion industry. You're so fashionable.
And hot.
Oh my lord. The smack him. You're allowed to smack him. I'm saying that.
you might like it, she might
Like
like
it.
it, you might like it.
Yeah. We're good now.
All right, everybody, can I get your attention real quick? It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Brian Miller. I told him I'm going to butcher his introduction. So he's got more degrees than Fahrenheit. Okay, we'll just say that. That's kind of who he is. How many were at the seminar on Sunday listening to Dr. Miller? 2 years? Okay, great. Well, this is, I believe what's going to happen is Dr. Miller is going to have a presentation, and then later on in the evening, we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A, interaction, see where everyone's questions are and whatnot. So now Dr. Miller is not a loudmouth like me, so we're going to have to really dial in and listen. Unfortunately, we have some technical difficulties with amplification. So without any further ado, we're going to kick this thing off, and Dr. Miller, God bless you. Man, good luck.
If I start to go too soft, the people in the back can just do this and I should be fine. If I'm going too fast, just let's New York, never mind, we'll be fine. I realized, I finally figured out why people talk really fast in the North. Because I went to school in Boston, I realized your brain has to go a lot faster in New York than it does in the South, right?
Yes, it
Because
does.
when you're walking on the streets in Nashville where I live, there's like lots of room and cars go pretty slow and they turn and use their turns. No, here it's like boom, boom, people all around you. You gotta watch taxis. So my brain just goes. I think that's why people talk faster. That's my theory, right? But at any rate, what I'm going to do tonight is talk a lot about my journey. The talk tonight is called The Skeptic's Journey, and I would be a skeptic just in case there was confusion about that. And, what happened was I was raised in the church growing up in Clearwater. Anyone raised Catholic here? Yeah, lots of people raised Catholic, and for me there's a lot of very staunch and faithful Catholics, but for me it was more of a cultural experience, and I just kind of grew up Catholic. It was just sort of a cultural thing. What happened is my senior year of high school, I read through the New Testament in its entirety, which I'd never done before, and a really dramatic experience. It was something like all the pieces that I had learned about came together, and I was accepted to MIT. So I looked like I had a very secure future, but I asked myself, well, I'm going to die in 70 years or so what's the point of life? So I was in that exploring stage and read through the Bible, and it just all made sense. It was like I was hearing God's voice, not in the kind of psychotic sense of the voice in my head, but much more in the deep sense that there was God that was real. It was very exciting. What happened was I went to MIT for undergraduate, and I lost my faith. I took a class on the Bible from a secular perspective. I read Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. Anyone read Richard Dawkins? Okay, yeah, so a few people. And I became pretty convinced that Christianity was just a psychological crutch. I thought the Bible was mythology. I thought that science, people that were intelligent and thoughtful would believe in science. People that were kind of fluffy and gullible would believe in religion. What happened was that was discouraging, because I realized at that point that if there was no God, if I was simply here by the blind forces of nature, life was pretty meaningless, right? Because if God doesn't exist and we're just going to die and all our memories are lost, it doesn't matter if we have a happy life or a sad life. It doesn't matter if you're cruel or kind. It doesn't make any difference, right? Because eventually the sun's going to explode. It's going to destroy our Earth, kind of like the movie Knowing. And even if we could colonize other planets, which is really unlikely, which I'll talk about, eventually the universe is going to run out of energy. It's going to expand, and we'll have a cold death of the universe, and then all life will be gone, and we'll just be particles floating through space. So, I know it's a deep thinker today. So I realized that life was meaningless if there was no God. And what happened is I remember praying in my room, and I looked to God, and to the ceiling there, right? And said, God, if you're real, you have to show me what's true, because I'm a scientist. And I have to know what's true. I have to have facts. I have to have clarity. I just can't believe this blindly. I thought maybe that was against the rules. Maybe you just can't do that. Maybe faith is supposed to be more fluffy. I don't know. But I said, God, that's the way it is, so please help me. And what happened is it put me on a very long journey, many years. And it took me through the study of science and philosophy and archaeology and cosmology and all these other ologies and isms. And I came back to faith. And part of it was an intellectual journey, and part of it was more encounters with God, in very, very dramatic and much more subjective ways that are hard to describe. But I came back to faith, and what I realized is so many people go to college and they're confronted by professors that are hostile to faith, or they're confronted by comedians like Tomar, whoever. They read the Da Vinci Code, and people come to the perspective that faith is irrational. And one of the myths of our culture is again, that it's either reason and science or faith and just subjectivity. And it really gave me a heart to, again, study this more and then present to people why the Christian faith is actually rational. And I particularly like talking to people that are agnostics or atheists, because I was there. I know what that lens is like. And I know that if you really think about reality, it's very, very depressing. There's no hope, there's no meaning, and that's why people essentially live very busy lives and are addicted to entertainment, because that's almost like the drug addict that's using the drugs to numb the pain of their life. It's because they don't want to stop and think about the futility of their existence. So what I want to do for you, and you're all invited to be here if you happen to be Christian, that's okay, it doesn't bother me, I'm not asking you to leave. But my heart is really for those of you that may be skeptics, but you're searching. You want to have meaning to life. If God is real, you want to know. And I'm here to help you. I'm not here to argue with you. If you don't want to believe that, that's cool. I don't want to cause you stress. In fact, it's not in your best interest to believe me if you don't want to follow God, because it just gives you a level of accountability you don't want to have. So if you don't want to believe what I have to say, I'll encourage you in your unbelief. But I'm here kind of like Morpheus, because I'm arguing that if you're from a skeptical background, what's happened to you is that you've been presented with a lot of lies and a false view of reality. And I'm offering you the red pill to break out of the matrix. And if you don't want that, you're welcome to take the blue pill and wake up and believe whatever you want to believe. It's up to you. But you're going to have to work with me. Because if you're in this system of lies and deception, it's very hard to break out of it. Because you've been taught to see the world through a certain lens. So I'm going to help you break free of the matrix, but you have to work with me, okay? So that's kind of what I'm going to be doing today. Let's go to the next slide. Someone with the slides? Everyone's going to look at the computer. I'm sorry, it's not automated. I actually. Thank you. Yeah, you've all seen this picture before? Mm-hmm. Yeah, who sees a picture of an old woman? Okay, who sees a young girl? Okay, let's turn the slide forward, because you won't be listening to me for the rest of the night, and if we don't do that, you're always like, what's the numbers? I don't know. Okay, let's go to the next picture, please. Okay, forward. There we go. Okay. So what happens, I'd love to have this illustration, but you don't listen to me when it's there, so we'll just turn it. What happens is the human brain wants to create a coherent picture of reality. That's how it works. So we all essentially have a lens that was put on us from our birth, a little bit after birth. Through watching commercials and TV and so forth, and we think the world's a certain way. And the challenge is, that's why so many people are so staunch in what they believe. You meet fundamentalists that seem a little narrow-minded? Yeah, it's the same thing. If you talk to fundamentalists and you tell them something that they don't think is true, it's kind of like the more reason you give them, the more evidence, the angrier they get. You notice that?
Yeah.
And then they always kind of go, well, the Bible says that I believe it, that settles it. Even if the Bible doesn't necessarily say it, but that's beside the point, right? Well, again, that's just sort of natural. And that's the same thing true with your skeptic fundamentalists. Like a Richard Dawkins is just kind of like a Jerry Falwell or a Billy Graham. It's really no difference. It's just a different faith. And what happens is it's really important to understand that nobody looks at evidence objectively. Everyone sees it through a lens. You're always either looking at the old woman or the young girl. That's the way it works. So the challenge is to realize that, and what I'm inviting you to do is to take off your glasses. Take off your glasses. And I'm inviting you to look at the world through a new set of lenses. So I'll be speaking to you as a Christian, inviting you into my frame of reference to show you that the world makes a lot more sense. That's how it's going to work tonight. So I want to begin. It's just kind of a quick overview of what that Christian framework is. And I'm going to talk to you about it in a story. It's much better than using big words like anthropology and cosmology and so forth. We're going to talk about a story. In the Christian framework, we believe that God created everything. We believe that God is personal, He's separate from creation, and He loves His creation. We believe He created the world as good. Everything was in harmony. It was a place where people were completely intimate with each other, and they had a vocation. They were meant to steward creation. Things went a little bit awry. That's life. That's the fall. And we believe as Christians that what happened is people had a choice to either follow God and trust Him as their creator, or to become God themselves. And that's the idea of the fall. There's sort of the temptation of becoming like God and deciding for themselves what's good and evil. You meet people that say, I'm going to decide for myself what's right and wrong. I'm going to give my own meaning in life, decide my own truth. That's kind of that picture. And things kind of went awry. So one of the biggest challenges that people have with Christianity, I'm going to hit right off the bat. We'll hit the issue of problem, evil, and suffering, right? Because people always ask, if there's a God, why is there evil in the world? Because if God is all good and all powerful, why doesn't he eliminate evil? Like, what's up with that? And again, what's interesting is I want to argue that you should listen to me because this story actually makes a lot more sense than any other story. Because it makes sense that if the creation was good and people rebelled against God, that the world would be really messed up, right? It kind of makes sense that if there is a God that loves humanity, he would intervene to do something about that. It kind of makes sense. And the challenge is, it isn't quite a simple thing because people say, why doesn't God eliminate evil and suffering in the world? Because we all have evil inside of us, right? We all have that nudge to be selfish or to snub people or to be arrogant or unkind. You know, we always take this extra cookie when no one's looking so Uncle Sam doesn't get it. You get the idea, right? So the challenge is we all have this evil in our hearts, and that's why the world is messed up. That's why there's environmental destruction. That's why there's racism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens as Christians, let's go to the next slide, is we believe we know how to solve the problems in the world. In part now, but eventually it'll be completely fulfilled. Because again, if you're a doctor, you're trying to cure somebody, the first thing you have to know is the source of the disease, right? What's causing the illness? You recognize the source of the illness is our broken relationship with God and with each other. And the Christian message is that God came to earth in the form of Jesus Christ, it's the image of God on earth, to reveal to people who God is, how we should live, and to break the power of evil in our lives. And that's the whole point of Jesus dying on the cross, is he defeated the power of evil on the cross. He took the evil in our hearts, extracted it, took it on the cross with him to defeat it. So that we as individuals can break the power of evil in our own lives, and we can be his agency to bring goodness in the world around us. That's the picture. And of course, the end of the story, the last slide, is this picture. It's an image from Revelation of Jerusalem coming back to earth. At the end of the story, we believe that God will restore all of creation, where the world will be beautiful and good the way it was meant to be. In the interim, people have a choice. Do they want to be part of restored creation? Do they want to follow Christ's commands and teaching us what a restored creation looks like? Or do we still want to rebel against our Creator and live however we want and be agents of destruction in the world? That's kind of the picture. So that's the story we're living. Now again, that, I argue, the Christian faith is the only story that makes sense. Because if you believe that we're simply here by the blind forces of nature, then you believe everything is simply a product of chance and time. Therefore, there is no good and there is no evil. What people think is good is simply a product of their evolutionary past or their social influence. Same with evil. So if you prefer Mother Teresa to Hitler, that's like preferring crunchy peanut butter to smooth peanut butter. There's no objective reason behind it. So again, I'm arguing that with the Christian faith, there is a purpose to life. Because if you don't think there's a God, if you think we're just here by chance, you're going to die, and it's all going to end. So I'm here to offer you hope. So let's begin our journey. Now, for me, I remember one of the issues for me that was a big issue was the issue of science. Now, if none of you, for those of you that don't like science that much, I apologize. I just can't resist. But what's interesting is people often have this perception that science and faith are at odds with each other. Who's heard that before? Who's kind of felt that? That's a perspective, that you have like the rational scientist who's always being oppressed by the religious bigot. It kind of goes back to, Galileo and all that sort of stuff. The Stokes monkey trial that was, the Stokes monkey trial that was done in the movie Inherit the Wind, if you've seen that. But what I'm going to argue to you is that's part of the matrix. That's a lie, that's a deception, that's simply untrue. Because the reality is, modern science was largely birthed in a Christian culture in Western Europe. Why? Because to do science, you have to believe in God. Because to do science, you have to believe in an orderly world. You have to believe that there's laws that are consistent that govern reality, which means there has to be a lawgiver. You also have to believe that we have the capacity to understand those laws. Now, if you think we're just here by the blind forces of nature, and I'm not pointing my finger and say shame, shame, shame. Again, I'm trying to help you out of the matrix. But if a person believes that, then why would we have the ability to understand quarks? Well, at least if you have a PhD in physics to understand quarks. Why should we understand the way the universe started? Why is it that we should understand chemistry? Does that help an animal survive? Does that help you get more food? It doesn't. It's kind of like we can understand the laws of physics because we are created in the image of the lawgiver. So to do science, you have to have faith that we have the ability to understand creation, which means you have to believe you're created by God, or else it makes no sense. And you have to have an impetus to study. So that's something I realized very quickly. The second thing, which is interesting, let's go to the next slide, is when people started to study the world, that's physics, chemistry, geology, and so forth, what they found was something quite shocking. What they found is that the laws of physics all seem to be designed with life in mind. And let me just kind of explain what that means. If you look at the laws of physics, if you look at things like Maxwell's equations or Schrodinger's equations, or maybe E equals mc squared, you've heard that, right? Yeah, when you look at the laws of physics, these are very simple laws. But what happens is these laws allow things like atoms. They allow things like chemistry. And what happens, if the laws were different, if they had a different form, we wouldn't have chemistry, we wouldn't have life, they wouldn't exist. So it's really incredible that these laws actually work. That doesn't happen by chance. Also, if you look at the laws of physics, there's these things called constants in physics. It's kind of like, force is g times m1, m2 over r squared. And it's kind of like, again, if you look at like those mixer boards in a studio, like in a sound system, you can move one knob up and one knob down. Imagine you're controlling gravity. You turn gravity up. What happens? You kind of go like this, right? You turn gravity down, you start to float up. Well, as it turns out, if gravity were much larger or much smaller, we wouldn't have planets. Life wouldn't exist. If the force, the electrostatic force, that's what causes static cling, that static cling stuff. If that were stronger or weaker, we wouldn't have life. If the force that held the nucleus together were different, we wouldn't have life. If water didn't float when it froze, we wouldn't have life. If it didn't have the specific conductivity, the specific gravity, if all these properties weren't just right, life wouldn't exist. So what you find is that there was a creator that designed our universe with life in mind. Not only that, it's not just that a creator started it all off, but the creator was involved in the process of the formation of our Earth. Because if our Earth didn't have like 100 characteristics that were just right, if it didn't have the right tilt, the right rotation rate, if there weren't plate tectonics, if there wasn't the right distance from the sun, life would not be possible. Not just our life, but any life. Because you have to have liquid water, you've got to have energy, and so forth. So again, there's a fellow named Hugh Ross. His website's reasons.org that has identified 800 parameters that all have to be just right or life would not exist. Which means that there is a God who created the world and a God who shaped the world actively so that we would be exactly who we're supposed to be. Now let's go to the next slide. One of the most interesting ones is the moon. Next, please. Because the theory of how the moon came about is that this asteroid slammed into the primitive Earth, which then caused a piece to spit out and form the moon. And also that collision allowed for our molten core, which allows for the magnetic field, which protects us from radiation, and the right heat. So what happened is this is an incredible example of, imagine trying to do this by chance. Imagine trying to throw an asteroid into a planet, just waiting for this moon to pop out exactly the right way. You get the idea, right? So what you see is, again, incredible fine-tuning and a creator that was involved in the shaping of every aspect of the formation of our planet. So, as a quick analogy, it's kind of like if you're walking through the woods and you come across a cabin, you go into the cabin, and that cabin has all your favorite food in the refrigerator, has all your favorite clothes that perfectly fit you, it has a cell phone with your top best friends programmed into it, your favorite DVDs, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to know that somebody knew you were coming, right? Because it's prepared for you. That's what our universe is like for us. That's really exciting. Now, let me just kind of mention briefly, because every argument has a counter-argument, that if you're gullible, you might buy into it. If you just look on a skeptic's website. But people argue that maybe there's like lots and lots of extra universes. It's called the multiverse. Because there's lots of extra universes that maybe we just got lucky. The problem is that's purely based on blind faith. We have no models to support that. The second problem is that you have to not just have lots of universes, but these universes would have to carefully scan through every possible parameter. And whatever would cause that to happen itself would have to be finely tuned by a creator. So you can't escape design in our universe. It's kind of like if you have a carpet that's too large for your room and kind of bulges in the middle. If you pull on the bulge in one place, what appears someplace else? A bulge. So every attempt cosmologists and scientists try to remove the fine-tuning with their theories, they have to fine-tune the new theories. That's kind of interesting. Let's go to the next slide. Also, what's interesting is many people have this perception that the real linchpin of the faith-science debate is life, right? Because people argue that Darwinian evolution has proven that we're here by blind chance, right? So this whole idea that evolution is sort of the trump card, it's like Richard Dawkins talks about almost like as an acid that dissolves religious faith. And what I'm going to argue for you is that biology isn't an exception to what I talked about. But biology actually shows some of the most exciting evidence for design around. Any biologists in here? No? Oh, okay, that's unfortunate. But let's just talk about the prebiotic soup. Because what many biologists will tell you is that on the early Earth, what happened is you have this atmosphere of various elements, and then maybe lightning bolts shocked the early atmosphere and created a prebiotic soup. It's kind of like the soup of all the building blocks of life. Did y'all heard of that before? Mm-hmm. Or at least watch Star Trek, something like that. And there's the perception that this is scientific fact, but it's actually scientific mythology. There is no evidence for a prebiotic soup. And just to kind of read you a quote, under slightly reducing conditions, the Stanley Miller experiment action does not produce amino acids, nor does it produce the chemicals that may serve as the predecessors of other important polymers, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go through the details. Go to the next one. No geological evidence for the existence of a prebiotic soup has been published. Indeed, a number of scientists have challenged the prebiotic soup concept, knowing that even if it existed, the concentration of organic building blocks would have been too small to be meaningful for prebiotic evolution. In other words, the whole idea of the origin of life is kind of a secular creation myth, which isn't true. We don't have the building blocks of life on the early Earth. They didn't exist from all that we can tell. But the challenge is, even if they existed, there is no way to get a cell by chance. Because, and let me use an analogy, it's called the second law of thermodynamics. How many of you have trouble keeping your room neat? Okay, so we know that's like, the rest of you, some of you are lying, I can tell. Some pictures out and spouses are saying, But the challenge is it easier to keep your room messy or neat? I mean, do you keep trying to make your room messy, but you come back and everything is a nice... Does that happen? Because nature wants to take things that are organized and make them disorganized. That's called entropy. Also, nature wants to take things from high energy to low energy. A simple example, does water run downhill or does it run uphill? It runs downhill. Would you ever expect water to run uphill outside of like a hurricane or something? No. Now a cell is something that's very high energy, right? That's why we eat food to survive, lots of energy. Cells are very ordered, right? So if you look at that situation, nature is trying to drive a cell back to simpler chemicals. If any of you into chemistry, it's called the free energy equation. Remember that? You've got the enthalpy minus, I'll talk to you. Minus your temperature times your entropy, that idea. What happens at all temperatures, nature will drive the cell back to simpler chemicals. That's the problem. Now, if you read Skeptic's website, if you go to alt.origin or you go to infidels.org or listen to people like that, what they'll tell you is that the second law of thermodynamics does not take place in an open system. You can't use it in an open system. That's like a system that's like the Earth because the sunlight's coming in and you get exchange, right? People that say that are obviously not physicists because that's really not true. Thermodynamics actually works in open systems. You just have to be a lot more careful. Now that's meaningful for the 3 of you who have taken physics, but those of you watching, and you listen to the website, just listen to what I'm saying. So the reality is people will often say that the energy from the sun can be used to create the order in the cell. That's the idea. Now again, that's not, let's talk about if that makes sense. If you have a messy room, and you open the windows and you let the sun in, is that going to cause your room to become neat? If you set your drapes on fire, will that cause your room to become neat? Yeah, they're probably not, right? Would it make your mother happy? That's a good definition of neat. Anyway, That's the problem. In order for you to have an organized cell, what has to happen is the energy from the sun has to be channeled in some way to drive that order. So for instance, in a living cell, you've got all these molecular machines that work like chloroplasts to take the energy from the sun and convert it into useful energy for the cell. And here's the key. Let's go to the next slide. You also have to have information. The information is in the genetic code tells the cell how to organize itself in such a way that it works. And there's no way on the early Earth that you will have mechanisms that channel the energy properly, nor will you have the energy, the information, because nature cannot produce information from scratch. Now, when you see Mount Rushmore, you know Mount Rushmore is designed, right? Does anyone think that's from the wind and erosion? Does anyone think, I know I can explain that with a hurricane, right? Nobody says that, right? Because the faces on Mount Rushmore are faces that match another pattern, right? It's information. Well, the genetic information is no different from the face on Mount Rushmore. It's not something that can only be produced by a mind. So again, when you look at life, it shows undeniable evidence for a design. That's encouraging. Let's go to the next slide. Now also, given that the origin of life is something that had to be done through design, it's not real. I don't really have to talk about evolution because if the origin of life is design, it kind of makes sense everything else is. So if I were wise, I would just skip this topic because it's highly controversial, but I'm not that wise, so I have to deal with it. Because again, what bothers me about the theory of evolution is I appreciate the fact that scientists have to try to come up with explanations that are simply from physics, right? I get that, from the laws of nature. I appreciate that. But the reality is, no thoughtful scientist should believe it works. It just doesn't make sense. In my experience, whenever I talk to scientists, and if they're open-minded, which is not so common all the time, and they look at the evidence carefully, it's extremely difficult for them to believe in evolution. But it's challenging. Remember I talked about the matrix? Remember I talked about the young, because again, the challenge is evolutionists are socialized and seeing the world through a certain grid, a certain pattern. It's sort of the condition. And the challenge also is that the theory of evolution has become the creation myth of Western culture. So it's that narrative that scientists can tell their children growing up. This is where we come from. And the challenge is it's so deeply entrenched in people's hearts that to challenge it is really challenging their faith commitments. And that's very hard. That's why when you talk to evolutionists, often they become very angry, very agitated, just like your fundamentalists, they're no different, when that faith commitment is challenged. So again, for those of you that may be coming out of the matrix, just listen to me carefully and don't get too excited as I walk you through this process. Now, what happens is the idea of evolution is that everything in nature came about by a step-by-step process of gradual change. So the idea would be that you've got a system with one piece and it works. It gets a second piece that works better. It gets a third piece and it's really rocking. And by the time you get to 10 pieces, you're really doing great. Does that make sense? Gradual, step-by-step improvement. Every step has to be an improvement for natural selection to work. The problem is, in nature, that's not what we see. We don't see systems that look like they develop piece at a time. We see things that are what are called irreducibly complex. That's a nice word to use, irreducibly complex. Now, the flagellum is a nice example of that. It's like an outboard motor because it spins like a propeller. Let's go to the next slide. That's a schematic of the side view of it. That's the outer cell membrane, the inner cell membrane. Next slide. And that's again, more of a logistics diagram. Now, when you look at that, the first thing that comes to your mind is not, wow, that looks like something that just came about by chance, right? That sure looks like what the blind laws of science could do. No, it looks like a motor because that's exactly what it is. In fact, you can compare it to a human-designed motor, and a lot of the pieces match up quite nicely. It's just this one is more clever and more sophisticated. It's at the micro level. And what's really important about it is it has lots and lots of pieces, like several dozen pieces. It's got a propeller that pushes the water. It's got a hook that keeps it rigid. It's got bearings to penetrate the cell wall. It's got an ion exchange system that gives it torque. It's got a shaft that takes it to the propeller. So it has lots of different pieces. And what's true about this motor is that you have to have all of these pieces at once, or it doesn't work. Now, you may have an example of a piece here that could be taken off or added, but there's at least a few dozen that have to be there for it to work. So that can't come about by a gradual step-by-step process of development, right? Either it's all there, you've got a flagellum, or it's not. And that's typical for what you see in nature. Most things in biology have lots of pieces that have to be there or they don't work. So that's called irreducible complexity. Now, what's happened is the evolutionists have responded to this argument. And what's interesting is their responses sound impressive as long as you don't think about them too carefully. Now, again, it's kind of like this. If you are innocent of a crime and you're trying to defend yourself, you don't really need all that great of a lawyer, right? I mean, there's no evidence for what you are. You don't need a great lawyer. But what if you're like guilty of sin? Like if you have a gun and you shoot someone point blank 3 times in the heart with 3 witnesses, you need a really good lawyer. You need a Johnny Cochran, right? So what happens is you need a good lawyer that's really good at kind of presenting the evidence in a certain way and kind of creating misdirection and confusion, right? So it's kind of like the situation when I read evolutionists responding to this. Now, when you look at this, it seems pretty obvious, right, that this can't come about by intelligence, by chance. Makes sense, right? But again, you've got evolutionists that present very clever arguments that if you're not watching can sound impressive. So what they argue is this. Let's go to the next slide. They argue that what happened is that all these pieces didn't come together at once, but maybe you have all these different pieces of your flagellum that were borrowed, of different molecular machines that were borrowed. Like here's an analogy. Building a mousetrap at once can be difficult, right? But maybe you borrowed the spring from a grandfather clock. Maybe you borrowed the piece of wood from a doorstop. Maybe you borrowed the Coke can top as the trap bar. So that's the idea. They call it co-option. So co-option is the idea that you can borrow all these pieces from different machines in the cell, bring them together to form the flagellum. Is that making sense? Well, you're not snowing you too much, right? Tracking? Okay, you're not seeing too many people dozing off or drooling or anything like that. Let's go to the next slide. So the idea is what happens is, this is a slide from a guy named Kenneth Miller, who's a kind of an evolutionary evangelist. He was kind enough to put a slide on the internet so I can show it to you. And what he argues is that the flagellum actually borrowed pieces from what's called the type 3 secretion system. So you have this molecular machine with like 10 pieces that could potentially be borrowed by the flagellum. And that's how it came about its borrowing, co-option. Now again, as a physics guy that actually is part of an inventor's guild that works with innovation, it's pretty obvious this isn't going to work. Now let's talk about that. Let's go to the next one. Let's go to the next one. Okay, and here's why it's not going to work. And let me use an analogy. If you buy, let's say you buy a piece of furniture, you ever do those kind of home assembly furniture pieces? Like you get a bookshelf. Now, let's say you have all the pieces of the bookshelf, right? Now, if you just randomly move the pieces around, will you ever form a bookshelf? What do you have to do? What do you have to read?
Instructions.
The instructions. And what usually comes with those bookshelves? Yeah, pictures and Allen wrench, right? Tools.
Yeah.
So what happens to build your bookshelf, you have to read the instruction guide. You have to use the tools to kind of turn the screws and get the thing together, right? Or at least hopefully that will happen. In the same way, with molecular machines, what happens is you have to have other machines to assemble them. Like this is a picture of what's called an interflagellar transport system. And this is for a cilia, which is like part of another irreducibly complex system. You notice it's like kind of those box cars that go up and they drop off pieces of your cilia and they take the waste products down. What happens is, in the same way that you have an Allen wrench that assembles a piece of your bookshelf, you have molecular machines that assemble the different pieces of your flagellum. Is that making sense?
Mm-hmm.
Plus you have instructions. You have an assembly program in your cell that tells your cell how to create the flagellum. All that has to happen at once. So you can't borrow pieces to build your flagellum because you'd have to change the assembly program and you'd have to have the tools to assemble it, which is fantastically improbable. Also, you'd have to somehow get these new pieces to the site where the flagellum is being produced. All of this is fantastically improbable. So again, this whole notion of co-option makes sense if you don't really think about it, but as soon as you look at the details, it falls apart. Okay, so that's the whole idea of irreducible complexity. So I'm going to skip some of the more complex calculations. So type in 24, enter. Type in 24, enter. Okay, good. Now that deals with the micro level. But now let's go to the macro level, because a lot of people argue if you look at the fossil record shows you that life evolved. Also, they argue if you look at the similarities in different species, like you know how vertebrates have that basic pattern, that hand pattern, like a dog, a human, an amphibian, and so forth. And they argue that the similarity in that pattern implies a common ancestor. Does that make sense? So they say that's irrefutable evidence for evolution. Well, let me ask you this. If you look at, let's say, a motorboat with an ignition switch, which was similar to the ignition switch on a motorcycle, which was similar to the ignition switch on a car, would you believe that's because they all evolved from a little toy truck? No. Why are those similarities there?
Same design.
They weren't designed, right? Right. So that's again, it's that lens, right? It's that filter. It's that set of assumptions. But there's another problem, which is actually much more serious. Now, who's seen those pictures on top? Who's seen those pictures on top? Okay, that's called Haeckel's embryos. And that's, again, presented in textbooks until fairly recently as irrefutable evidence for evolution. And what you see are the embryos of fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, going from left to right. And the top picture is earliest embryos, then the next stage of embryos, and the next stage of embryos. Now that looks impressive, right? The problem is it's fraudulent. You see the picture below? Those are the true embryos. You see a slight difference? So again, that's just an example of what happens when evolutionists look at the data. They filter it through their lens. And then when it's presented to the public, typically it's kind of massaged and it's sort of packaged, so it presents it feeling impressive. When in fact it may not be that impressive. In fact, the situation is really bad with the embryos. Because if you look at, when I say embryology, what I mean is that's like an egg that becomes like a blastula, that becomes an embryo, that becomes an adult. Okay? That's embryology. You've all seen those pictures. The idea is that if evolution is true, the embryology of the vertebrates should be the same, right? That just makes sense. Because it's really hard to change the development of the embryo without screwing everything up. That's why birth defects are so dangerous. The problem is that's not the case. The earliest stages of the embryos of the vertebrates are completely different. Totally different. The cell division, the migration, which suggests that the vertebrates were all designed independently by a designer. So that's a bit of an issue of homology. Next slide. Well, let's talk about the fossil record. Because there's sort of this impression that in the fossil record, what you see typically is you'll have like, cheetah that grows a little bit more, gets better posture, becomes a scientist, right? and that's kind of that progression that people think exists. But that's again secular mythology. The whole, you've all seen the evolutionary tree, right?
Yeah.
It's a figment of evolutionist imagination. There is no evolutionary tree. Pretty much everything represents leaves on the tree. Because again, think about it. If you went back in time, what would you expect to see? You'd expect to see that whales and chimpanzees and mice should look more and more similar, right? Until you get back to the common ancestor of all mammals. And then if you looked at everything, from worms to starfish to clams, as you go back in time, they should look more and more similar as you go back through the tree. That makes sense, right? That's not what you see. What you see is cells appear very, very early. Then you have what's called the Cambrian explosion, where you see the first representatives of the different body types of mammals. They appear suddenly out of nowhere, and then whenever you see a fossil appear, it never changes. It's always the same. It's called stasis. Evolutionists use the term punctuated equilibrium. And that's typical. Let's go to the next slide. Because whenever you see anything appear, even later in the fossil record, it typically appears suddenly and it doesn't change. Next slide. Here's a picture from a more sophisticated textbook, and those little black bulbs represent different orders within the vertebrates. And you see those little dashed lines? They represent the ancestors of things like the primates, things like your whales. They go back to a common ancestor. Next slide. The problem is they don't exist. You don't see the trunks of the trees. Now, occasionally evolutionists do talk about transitional fossils, right? Like the whale series or Archaeopteryx or, okay, that's fine. Those of you that don't, you can think about lunch and dinner. I'll call you back when we get out of science now. But whenever evolutionists use the term transitional species, what they don't mean is that you have an ancestor-descendant relationship. What they mean is you have something like a toaster oven. You have a species which share characteristics of two different groups. Like they'll have a bird that has certain reptile features. But here's the thing. If you go from a toaster to an oven and stop halfway, do you have a toaster oven? You have a mess. In the same way, there's not one example in the fossil record of a series of fossils showing ancestor-descendant relationships where change is taking place. Whenever the fossil record is clearest, things appear suddenly and don't change. Now it's interesting because in most fields of science what people do is when you've got overarching theories, you look at the largest amount of evidence and where the evidence is clearest, right? Now even for the non-scientists, that makes sense, right? What evolutionists always do is they look at where the evidence is more spotty, more ambiguous. And they don't look at the overall pattern, they look at exceptions to the overall pattern, which is where they put the emphasis on their theory. That's a serious problem. And we can talk more about that if you so desire. But that's just an issue of biology. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and the question becomes, though, and this is a very fair question, am I just a lunatic? And that's even beside my talk, just in general interpersonal relationships. So let's put that aside. If all biologists believe in evolution, why should you listen to me? That makes sense, right? And that's kind of what you hear if you talk to biologists. They'll say, well, all biologists believe in evolution, all serious scientists believe in evolution. It's only those religious crackpots who don't, who refuse to look at the evidence. After all, anyone who believes in intelligent design is just with a bias, and they haven't published anything, right? Have you even heard that? It's a funny idea, right? Well, again, that's part of the secular mythology. The Discovery Institute, who really promotes these ideas, has collected like a list of 600 scientists, including biologists, at discovery.org, who critique evolution. And that's just those who are willing to face the ridicule. For everyone that's willing to put themselves out there, there's tons of scientists that question it but are afraid to mention their doubts. It's kind of like if you're in a fundamentalist church, you want to say you question what the preacher is saying? Is that a good thing? Do they think, oh, thank you so much for questioning my ideas. Please come to the front. Does that usually happen? No, it's like you leave the church because you're a skeptic. You're not buying into you're not drinking the Kool-Aid, right? I'm not saying that's all churches, obviously, but that's sort of the stereotype, right? It's the same thing in biology. It's like if you don't drink the Darwinist Kool-Aid, you can't play the game. Now, here's a neat quote. It's from a professor of biology at Harvard. He says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories. Because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Materialism means that's just all that exists is matter and energy. Next slide. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Let me translate that for you in a less charitable way. Screw the evidence, we don't believe in a creator, and that's just the way it's going to be. So again, that's why so many biologists don't accept intelligence, because that's their faith position. So, that's the issue of science. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the next issue that I had to deal with when I was going through my skeptic's journey is, okay, so science points to a creator. How do we know that creator is Yahweh as opposed to Vishnu or Allah? Why do we believe the Bible is true? Does science help with that? I mean, not so much, right? We got a creator, but it's not like if you look at the DNA, if you read, John 3:16 in it, right? So the question is, how do you believe in the Bible? And that was my next struggle, because when I took my Bible class, I was told that the Bible is just full of fables. There are people with agendas. You've heard that, right? And what was interesting is, as I studied this more and more, what I realized is those people weren't basing their arguments on the evidence, but they were ignoring the evidence to have their arguments. And let me just use an example. Let's read from Luke chapter 1. many have undertaken to draw an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. That's not the beginning of a fairy tale. That's not once upon a time, long ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's a little bit different, right? That's the classic beginning of what's called a historical biography by a historian. Now, what's interesting is, you may not remember this, but Mark was used by Matthew and Luke, right? You see the similarities. Matthew and Luke is hypothesized to use a source called Q. That's why there's similarities in Matthew and Luke that are not in Mark. And if you look at the way Luke used Mark and the way Luke used Q, because we have Matthew, we see that he was faithful. He didn't just make up crazy things. So from all that we can tell, Luke was a good scholar. Now let's go to the next slide. This is another classic quote. It is evident that the entire historical framework in which the gospel picture is set is real, that the facts of the civil history, small and great, are true, and the personages correctly depicted. Next. To suppose that there is this minute historical accuracy in all the accessories of the story, and that the story itself is myth, is absurd. And this is an older quote. This is kind of a historic quote by George Rawlinson. But if you look more recently, you have like Ramsey. You have another classic book, is The Historical Jesus by Craig Keener. So there you have a lot more recent quotes. But the basic sum of the story is, when Greco-Roman historians look at Luke, they're extremely impressed by his accuracy, because he talks about countless cities, he talks about countless leaders, he talks about countless descriptions of boat journeys and so forth. He gets the details right. And because the leaders changed so quickly, and they didn't have Google at that time, it was extremely difficult for him to do that unless he really was an eyewitness of what was taking place. And again, if you look at Paul, there's correspondences with Luke. So again, as far as we can do, test, both archaeologically, internal evidence, and so forth, is that this is real history. Now, when skeptical scholars question the historicity of the New Testament, when they say it's unhistorical, they create methods of investigation which no competent historian would ever use. That's serious bias. So the Bible, if you're an objective historian, comes up well. The New Testament, the Old Testament's much harder because there's less evidence, but the New Testament comes up very well, particularly in Acts. And that was encouraging to me. That was very nice. But what I want to do now is I want to go to the one more topic, and then I'll get to the piece de resistance. Now, one thing you may have read, if you ever watched the video Zeitgeist or seen Bill Maher, if you watch skeptics, it's interesting because what they often claim, let's go to the next slide, is that there's all these parallels between Jesus and other mythic gods like Horus. And they'll say that, here's an example of the parallels with Horus, that he was born on December 25th, born of a virgin. He came with a star in the east. He was adored by 3 kings. He had a teacher of 12. He was baptized and had a ministry at 30. Next one. Back one. He performed miracles. He was called the Lamb of God, the Light. He was crucified. He was dead for 3 days and resurrected. Now, when you look at the parallels between Horus and Jesus, does that make you a little bit nervous? It's like, what's up with that? And that would be very compelling evidence against the Christian faith, except it's all made up. It's literally made up. It was produced by anti-Semitic Germans who wanted to detach Christianity from Judaism so they could persecute the Jews. It's in the proud tradition of Holocaust deniers. So again, this is what's happening out there, is people are just throwing out lies in order to attack people's faith. In fact, when I was, my friend again who was doing PhD work at Duke said that a lot of the professors would say things against the New Testament they would never say when the grad students were around because they couldn't get away with it. That's just sort of an interesting side note. So again, this is just complete mythology. But now here is what I consider the most interesting evidence for the Christian faith. Let's go to the next slide. It's called the Shroud of Turin. Now, who's heard about the Shroud? Okay. Who's heard that the Shroud was carbon dated and proven to be a fake? A few people. Who has heard that that dating has been discounted? Yeah, we'll talk about that. What happened is not so many years ago, back in the 80s, the shroud was dated. In fact, I'll show you a picture of that in a second. Let's go to the next slide. That's actually a picture of the shroud. What happened is it shows Jesus' face, his front, his legs, and then because it wrapped around the back, you can see the back of the head, the back, and the legs too. That's why it has that frontal and back image. Now, you see those black lines on the top and the bottom? You can ignore those because that was put in later by a fire. So that was when it was damaged in a fire. So you can ignore that. But that's a picture of what the shroud is. It's a linen wrapping about 4 meters long, 1 meter wide, roughly. And what's interesting about it is it contains evidence from the crucifixion in blood stains and in human remains. And it contains a ghostly image from the resurrection. But before I get to that, let's talk about the carbon dating. Next slide. Okay, now a sample was taken in 1973. And part of the sample dated to about 1000 AD and part to 200 AD. So they knew this dating would be really problematic. So what happened was this team of scientists said, why don't you take 8 samples from different places? Well, the protocol was scrapped, and 1 sample was taken in 1988. That's a sample. Next slide. Here's a videotape of the sample. Notice that seam running through the sample? So what happened is there was a seam that was sewn in much, much later. That was part of the sample that was carbon dated. And this has been confirmed by research done by Ray Rogers. He's submitted papers. And even, if you see the article like in Yahoo, like a week ago, there's actually Italian scientists who have also confirmed that the sample was contaminated with later fibers. So the carbon dating has pretty much been discredited. However, what we can talk about is, can we actually date the shroud? Next slide. Well, here's actually flower images that are on the shroud. And the combination of flower images only are from flowers that exist only one place on Earth. Guess where that is? Around the area of Palestine. Next slide. There's actually pollen samples that were taken that match the flower images. In fact, the Dr. Wanger, Alan Wanger and Mary Wanger, who actually gave me these slides, they're internationally known researchers. They have the pollen samples in their basement. They have pollen that's on the head of Christ in the basement. That's pretty cool.
That's really amazing.
So, next slide. But the way we know also that the shroud is authentic is if you look at images from very early, what you see is that the pagans copied images from the face of Christ onto their deities. This is the first depiction of Zeus in frontal view, and it's done around 31 AD. And there's 79 what are called points of congruence. That's like curves and lines that match up. In a quarter wall, you need 60 points of congruence to prove 2 images are the same. So we know for a fact that the people that produced this image of Zeus copy it from the face of Christ, because all images of deities before this were done in profile, because gods were seen as very, very distant. But when Jesus came on the scene, he was very, very personal. So as the Christians were healing the sick and doing all sorts of amazing stuff and talking about a personal God, pagans wanted to copy that onto their own deities. It's kind of like when kids want to wear Michael Jordan shoes to give that same basketball. It's sort of the same thing. So again, the deities from that time period forward were copied from the face of Christ. Next slide. Here's other images. The first depiction of Buddha in frontal view is copied from the face of Christ in the 2nd century. Next slide. Here's again an icon from the 6th century. Again, those little red lines and circles are points of congruence because it was copied from the face of Christ. Next slide. However, what's even more interesting is if you look at the medical evidence, and forensic pathologists have done this, every detail from the Gospels is on the shroud. You see contusions from the scourge marks. You see the wound through the wrist. The Greek word for hand includes the wrist. You see wounds through the feet. You see the spear wound in the side. You see puncture wounds from the crown of thorns. You see lashes on the back. So again, every detail in the Gospels is confirmed by the shroud, which again shows that the Gospels are not mythology, but based on fact. Next slide. But it gets even better than that. This is where I really like. This is really cool stuff. What people realize is when you take a photograph of the shroud, the negative of the photograph is actually clearer, because the shroud acts like a photographic plate. Because the image, not the medical evidence, but the faint body image is produced by radiation. For those of you that are in chemistry or physics, it's an oxidation, dehydration of the surface fibers that are a few microns thick. Going back to English, if you take like a shirt, and put it in the sun, what does the radiation of the sun do? It causes the shirt to yellow. It's an artificial agent. So the image on the shroud is produced by radiation, which artificially enhances the aging. And it also contains three-dimensional information. And I won't go into the details, but what it means is that the radiation from the body of Christ came vertically like laser beams. Like radiation normally goes in all directions. But it's like millions of little lasers came from the body of Christ and burned the image onto the cloth. So that's the frontal image. That's pretty interesting. Next slide. And also what they noticed is not just the image from the surface of the body, but they saw an X-ray of the skull on the image of the shroud. And this is an enhanced view of the shroud on the left. You take the plus image, the minus image, offset it, you get this three-dimensional enhanced view. And notice the similarities between the face of Christ and his skull. You can see the orbitals of the eyes, the nasal cavities, the sinus cavities. You can even see the roots on the teeth and the jawbone that floats beneath the beard. Now, that's not because of decomposition, because we know the shroud, the man in the shroud was not decaying, he was just in rigor mortis. So X-rays had to come from within the body to burn an image on the shroud. What would cause that? Well, the best explanation is by a Canadian physicist, I think from Toronto, Dr. Trent, and he commented that what may have happened, the best explanation, is that the atoms in the body could have come apart. The strong nuclear force could have come apart, could have been overcome. The electrons could have come to the surface, producing the coronal discharge, and then that could have caused the X-rays. So it's kind of like a Star Trek dematerialization. But the question is, what would cause it? That's like a nuclear bomb, that amount of energy.
Wow.
And that's essentially where science ends and faith begins. So how do you explain that? Well, if you're skeptical, you could say it could have been time travelers or aliens or the Star Trek Enterprise or something like that. But if you're not willing to go there, it kind of sounds like the resurrection. And again, this is encouraging because this is kind of like, for me, Thomas, because Thomas was a rather skeptical follower of Christ. And he said, after Jesus rose from the dead, that I will not believe unless I touch the wounds in his wrists and the wounds in his side. Jesus appeared to Thomas and didn't go, shame, 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 you shouldn't question, he was blind. But he allowed him to touch the wounds in his wrists and the wounds in his side. Because he wanted to give him that extra piece of evidence just to show that he loved him and wanted to meet him in the mind. The shroud is for us scientific types that want to touch the wounds in the wrist and the wounds in the side. It's very encouraging. And that's kind of my message for you, if you're from the more skeptical background, is that in some ways it seems kind of silly to argue for God, because if couldn't God just reveal himself, right? And that's exactly what happens. In fact, I've done many of these talks, and people have come up afterwards and prayed for and have been healed of sickness. And anyone have a gift of healing in here? Any healers? Oh, well, you're out of luck. Okay, go to that guy afterwards. Other people, what they've done is after the talk, again, this is just an invitation. I'm just Morpheus showing you the tensions in the worldview and offering the red pill. That's what I am. But there's people that have gone home and said, God, if you're real, show yourself to me. And he did. So the issue isn't that God's lost, but you are. That's sort of the problem. And it's sort of an issue of humility. And if you do encounter God, you have to surrender to his will. That's just kind of the way it works. It just makes sense. He's your creator. So for any of you that might be skeptical, my encouragement to you is to do that. And God will meet you in whatever way you need to be met. I'm a scientist, so cellular information and shrouds are cool. But if you have different sensibilities, God can meet you in different ways. So that's just my encouragement. Thank you very much. And now, question and answer. Any questions? Hold on for a second. What usually happens is I get the kind of Bible believer that says, well, when I was reading the Bible, I just wondered, I prefer if the skeptic started, and you don't have to be a skeptic, but if you have more of a skeptical question, not like were there dinosaurs on the ark or anything like that. I mean, you can go with that. But any like real juicy questions? Yes.
Sir, Brian?
Yes.
Do you love me?
You seem like a great guy.
So you love me? I can say without doubt that I love you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Do you love me?
I love you. feel the bond. That's awesome. Yes?
I have a coworker who's like, gosh, he was at NYU.
This is kind of like I have a friend who's an alcoholic. It's really not me. You know?
Oh, no, it's not me. No, really, it's not me. Anyway. And he's
is it her?
always,
No.
no, it's not me. He's always challenging me about, you know, the Bible, and I feel ill-equipped. I know the Bible says that, you know, those who are he also equipped, but he's like into science, and I've even gone into YouTube to like, you know, try to what's the word? Prove to him, like, you know, the word is true, and because I feel like if I can't defend, like if I can't really articulate myself, at least I can show somebody who can. And I just feel, sometimes I feel like God, as a Christian, I feel like I can't really talk about my faith, because it's like when I encounter people like that, like they'll get like all scientific with you, and I'm like, well, yeah, you know, and it's like, so I guess you guess like, what's the question? My question is, how can I best articulate myself to scientists? Like how can you prove God to someone who's like very, very skeptical but they try to throw you off with all this scientific stuff that you're really not?
I think it's helpful.
Doc, I don't mean to interrupt. We might have to, because we're streaming this and recording, so we might have to stand up and get the, just so we get the audio. We want to make sure, because everyone's got that question.
Okay, so the question becomes, what happens when you talk to a scientist if you're not that scientific? And they're bringing up all this stuff. Again, what's important to those, I think that the matrix maybe is really, really helpful. It talks about how you can't really unplug a person from the false world system if they don't want to be unplugged. There has to be a desire. What you can do is figure out where they are and just help them where they are. You can send them YouTube links. Discovery Institute has lots of great videos. Discovery.org has great videos. A lot are on YouTube. You can just send them those links. But you can ask them, what's also helpful is to really encourage them to think about the implications of what they believe. Because if they believe, again, they're just products of the blind forces of nature, that has really serious implications. And when they think about that, then they might be ready to listen to you. But if they don't want to be shown a different view of reality, there's nothing you can do. If they are willing, there's lots of books out there. Like I helped with the God is Not Dead book. The Discovery Institute has great videos, Unlocking the Mystery of Life, Privileged Planet. Tons of great books and videos. But again, they first have to be willing to take that step. So that's just my encouragement. Yes, Sarah?
My question is, when you were talking about evolutionist skepticism, it got me thinking that it seems that evolution seems to be the alternative science has turned to, because they found the church age and the repression of science during the Enlightenment, or just prior to the Enlightenment, to be a really oppressive thing for human discovery, which I think has some validity. Like it did read like to science that said that women shouldn't be in roles that men were in because they weren't as they weren't designed in that place. And I think it seems from scientists' point of view that the idea of a designer can be an oppressive thing if it becomes prominent in science, because it leads people to put constraints on human development and social development. So I'm wondering, what do you see as the positive future for intelligent design as far as its impact on society?
Right, and that's a big issue. There's a lot of people are concerned historically that science or religious people can hold back science. And that's not an unfair concern. Like, I won't name names, but there were scientific movements among Christians in order to defend certain positions which were not easy to defend. And they created scientific systems that really were pretty poorly thought through. And then they attacked good science often. So there's sort of this animosity created between the Christian community and the scientific community. And historically, it's been the case that the church has been overly oppressive. But again, that has nothing really to do with what Christianity is. Because again, historically, when the Roman Empire essentially made Christianity the religion of empire, Constantinism, as people call it, that alliance was very destructive for the church, because then it became profitable for people to join the church and get positions of power, even if they weren't faithful, which is very problematic. You get things like crusades, you get things like the Inquisition, lots of nasty stuff. But that has nothing to do with the core truth of Christianity. I mean, no one who believed in Darwinism would question it because of the Holocaust, and Hitler was into Darwinism. They would say it was a bad application. It's the same thing. Now, again, the question becomes, how can it be helpful to understand a creator? Well, I would argue that denying design has held back science. Because what's happened is when evolutionists have seen something like pieces of DNA that didn't make sense, they call it junk DNA. It's kind of the Darwin or the gap step argument. But as people studied it more, they actually found functions. And that's the case. Like, people said that there were like 100 vestigial organs, like things that just didn't belong there, including the spleen and the liver in humans, which they eventually realized had a purpose. So again, evolutionists held back science. In fact, also, even evolutionists acknowledge that the Darwinian framework has caused them to completely misinterpret the fossil record. Because they argue that there was gradual development of forms, and that's just not the case. So that's caused them to misinterpret the fossil record. I think and there's two other major downfalls. One is, let me use an analogy. If we had discovered a spaceship, in Area 51, 50 years ago, what would every scientist try to do with that spaceship?
Recreate it.
Yeah, they try to reverse engineer it, right? So that we could get the technology. Well, the cell is like a spaceship. And if we understood that it was designed, we would have been much more aggressive at trying to copy the recipes of life for our engineering systems. As it turns out, our engineering models, our industrial model is destroying the environment. It's creating lots of waste. Life doesn't do that, does it? So if we are able to copy the recipe of life and use it, we might be far ahead in a much more healthy industrial system. The second issue is medicine. Because medicine works against your body. Like, pharmaceutical interventions basically counteract what your body wants to do. In fact, do you ever see those commercials? Like, take our wonderful depression drug. And then they say, but it may cause death. It may cause internal bleeding. I'm like, whoa! Why do you use these commercials? I don't get it. But that's the point. It's because in the Enlightenment, you have this man against nature model. It's like Francis Bacon. We can force nature to reveal its secrets as we oppress it. Very man against nature. If you understand that we're created by God to be part of nature, we'd be much more harmonious. Our medical system would be much more preventative. It would be much more health-oriented. It would be much more nutrition-oriented. Because again, the majority of disease in America is just bad nutrition and lack of exercise. So our medical models would be way ahead of where they are now if we recognize design. Also, with design, we can ask new research questions, like to what extent can you tolerate changes before it breaks down? What are the aesthetic values? To what extent is it optimized? Those questions can't be asked if you don't recognize the design. So I'm not saying that evolutionists should stop. They have an obligation to push science as far as it can go with the naturalist framework. I'm just saying that if other scientists were free to use a design framework, they'd probably get better results. And as far as the oppression, is a great point. It's like, isn't that a good question? Isn't religion so oppressive? They promoted slavery and sexism and racism and all that, and they did, and they were wrong. Because the big challenge is always for the faith not to be contaminated by the culture. It's a challenge. And again, this is sort of an interesting analogy. Is when you've got life is taking in nutrients so that it actually exists in a state that's very different from the way nature actually works, right? But now, when a plant dies, it turns back into the same thing around it, right? And the same thing when the Holy Spirit is at work in a Christian's life or at work in a church. The church can stand against oppression and culture. It can stand against racism. It can stand against sexism. It can stand against it. But when the Spirit is resisted and quenched, then the church, again, looks just like the world with the same oppressive systems. So the critique against the church is completely valid, and many times. I live in Nashville, trust me. But the problem is not Jesus Christ. The problem is that the church is disconnected from Jesus Christ. So, okay. You have to ask one.
I have another Darwinistic question. Are there areas of evolutionary science that are pretty much agreed upon?
You mean,
that you might agree upon?
well, microevolution is definitely true.
Mm-hmm.
We see that. I mean, bacterial resistance.
What's the question?
Are there areas of evolution I would agree with? And most thoughtful Christians will recognize that microevolution is true. That you do have some beneficial mutations, like in malaria that can resist various antibiotics. But again, all of the microevolution is very, very limited. In fact, even paleontologists recognize that what happens in the fossil record is very, very different than what happens today, because it's so fast, it's so dramatic, that it's not even similar. So I would say micro is true, macro is not. Let me use an analogy. If you've got let's say the first act in Macbeth, you can turn a has into a had, right? And that might be helpful, but you can't create a whole new paragraph out of scratch. That's macro. Common ancestry is a very interesting question because there is evidence that suggests that may be true. So the question is common ancestry true? That's an open question. And some ID people believe in it, some people don't. Like if you take a time machine back, what would you see? Would you see a gradual development, or would you see like a whirlwind and then a human appears, right? And that's an open question. So that's a point of agreement people might also have. Does that make sense?
Okay.
And you had a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask where you stood on that. Where do you think new species come from? Do you think they are born, or?
Well, again, I mean, you have to be very careful in your definition of what a species is. So you could, like, for instance, let's imagine you killed every dog except for Great Danes and puppies. Then you got.
This went down real fast.
Okay, sorry about that. Let's imagine you moved all of those dogs to Australia. Nice, happy homes and so forth. It would seem like in America you have two different species because a poodle can't mate too well with a Great Dane, right? So it's possible. Well, at least very painful, I imagine. So what happened? The point is, you can get a new species if you have like a separation of a given species and genetic changes take place. But that's a very different thing than having a new body type or having truly innovative transformation. That's what you really don't see naturally happen. Big difference.
Just a kind of clarification, understanding what you're saying. So, a dog is a dog. You don't, two dogs don't make a whale.
Right.
In other words, or another type of an animal that doesn't
Right.
exist from those genetic.
Right. You're exactly right. So you can have small changes that go back and forth, but you can't get major changes without radically re-engineering the genome in ways that are phenomenally improbable. Another question? Let me ask him first.
I'm curious what the skeptics say about the Shroud.
Great question. How do skeptics respond to this? Usually they ignore the evidence, they misrepresent the facts, and they malign the researchers. That's the usual response. What's happened historically is, again, imagine, this is a great analogy. Imagine that you're in the ocean drowning, and you see like a piece of plankwood. What are you going to do with that plankwood?
Grab
With all your heart, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is if there's any little bit of evidence that's in doubt, the skeptics cling to it with all their might. Like it used to be the carbon dating. So they used to ignore all the evidence of the pollen and all this other stuff and cling to the carbon dating with all their heart. Unfortunately, the dating has been discounted. So now what they do is they focus on the burial customs, because the first century burial customs for Jews were different than what the Shroud looks like. And that's not necessarily surprising because Jesus was very different, right? But also because Jesus died in shock, when an individual died kind of this very horrible, violent death, they wouldn't bury them the same way as they would someone that just died normally. But nevertheless, because that's a little bit of doubt you can hang on to, it's kind of like that plant that they cling to with all their heart and ignore the rest of the evidence. But typically they just ignore it. That's what happens usually. Yes?
You said that the deities were made in the image of Jesus. Where are they coming in the picture from?
What, say it again?
You said that the deities are made in the image of Jesus.
Oh, great question. Where did they get the image of Jesus' face from the Shroud? What happened is there is King Abgar V in a city called Edessa, and that was in modern-day Turkey. And the king actually wrote a letter to Jesus asking him to come up and heal him of his leprosy. But Jesus was obviously too busy saving the world. So what happened was one of the disciples, this is constructed from a ton of different historical documents, Ian Wilson talks about this, is a disciple took the burial cloth of Jesus, wrapped it up like a painting, put a frame around it so you could just see the head. So it was, at that point it was later called the Holy Mendilion, or the Ocupatos, which is the painting name without hands. They took it to the king. The king was actually healed of his leprosy, so he took the image of Jesus' face and put it on top of the city gate. So when people would come to the city of Edessa, they would see this image on the city gate, copy it, and take it to other cities. That's where it came from. So incidentally, what happened was the king's son was not a Christian, so the shroud was hidden in a niche above a city gate and was lost to history for about 400, 500 years. Then when there was a damage to the city from the disaster, it was rediscovered. And that's when the icons again appeared from the shroud. So, yes?
The bit about Horus and the similarities, how was that, I mean, you mentioned that people created, the Germans created that?
Yeah, they just
Did
made
they make hieroglyphics, or like, I don't understand
They
why
just
tried
made
to
it
do
up.
that.
They just said these are similarities when they didn't exist. They just out of
They
thin
just
air.
published
Yeah.
an idea.
Yeah, they just published it.
You say Germans, you mean Nazis?
I mean, yeah. No, actually, I think it was a little bit earlier. I think it was more, the anti-Semitism goes back a bit deeper.
No, just Horus. They just said there were similarities with Horus, but Bill Maher.
Yeah, and they just copied the same. Like there was a scholar that talked about these similarities, and a lot of the people like Bill Maher and the other skeptics just copied that information, but never researched it to know that it was completely made up. And you hear that all the time. Another trick is this: what they'll do is they'll look at documents of like the mystery religions and things like that, and they'll show how there's similarities between Christianity and these other religions. And that'll be a problem, except the documents are after Jesus. They post-date Jesus. So what happened was, again, the pagans copied the Jesus story to make their stories more appealing. So the parallels go that way, not the other. People don't play fair, just so you know that. Let's see, who else has a you're one?
Hi. Yeah, I'm just wondering, Stephen Hawking always fascinated me. But one thing I heard recently, he said philosophy is dead.
Right.
And what is, in English, string theory? Like
Okay.
that everything, it's
Right,
possible
right.
that everything came from nothing.
Well, that's a little bit. I'll get into that. Well, Richard Hawkins. I mean, Stephen Hawking said, philosophy is dead. So did Lawrence Krauss. They're just being immature. Like, let me just put it that way. That's as simple as that. I mean, I could just say, oh, well, English is dead. I mean, but what's the basis of that? Physicists can be a little bit arrogant, speaking from personal experience. I just remember, this is a great story of, at one of the commencement speeches to one of the universities, let's say it's Columbia, it probably isn't, but let's say it's Columbia. The director of physics said, physicists not only do physics better than everybody else, they do everything better than everybody else. Which may be why I'm talking about biology. It's probably that same jag. Anyway, so again, physicists are just kind of really bitter with postmodernity. So a lot of philosophy of science people are showing that science is not as objective as they say it is. That kind of ticks them off. So that's just more sour grapes. But let's get into substance. You mentioned something. Oh, string theory, right. So what happens is in quantum mechanics, what happens? Not auto mechanics. Quantum mechanics. If you get really, really small, what happens is things look really odd. Like if you throw a baseball, the baseball falls in a nice, neat trajectory. The ball's a nice little circle you can look at. As you get smaller and smaller, you don't get that. Atoms aren't nice, neat, little. Like remember in your grade school days, you see these little circles going around. It's not like that. Matter looks like waves. It's this fluctuation of energy that you can't really get your mind around. It's completely different. So quantum mechanics, as you get smaller and smaller, everything starts to fluctuate like mad. That's quantum mechanics. You can't tell where something is and its momentum at the same time. That's the uncertainty principle. it's fuzzy. Everything gets fuzzy. It's like probability density functions. Don't worry about that. For those 3 of you that understood that. General relativity deals with things that are very big, like the universe. And general relativity tells you how, let's say, light bends around a star. Very smooth, very nice equations. However, as you start to combine those realms, like the realm of large gravity with very, very small, those equations don't match up. There's complete contradiction. So it's that boundary that said, we've got to figure out how to get this to work. That's where string theory came in. So string theory is essentially the idea that everything, when you look down at its smallest level, like quarks, are actually these vibrating strings. And the different vibrations will determine what particle it is. So the idea is, the big problem is what happened when the universe began. And to explain that, again, everything is really small, but very high energy and high gravity. So they have to create what's called a quantum theory of gravity, which again is trying to mesh these 2 realms together. So string theory is an attempt to explain how everything has come about and how everything fits together. It's a universal theory. So what scientists are trying to do is argue that string theory could explain multiple universes with different laws of physics. It could explain how a universe could pop into existence from nothing. The problem is they have no working models of any great detail. They can't make predictions. It's all science fiction at the moment. Speculation and science fiction. So when Hawking says, oh, because of gravity, the universe would just pop into existence, he's blowing smoke.
But is it possible?
Well, again, maybe. But here's the problem. Let's say it is possible. Let's say you could come up with a theory that would explain how it happened and how these other universes would happen. For it to work, to produce life, it would also have to be finely tuned. That's the issue. Okay? Let's get you again.
Yeah, sorry for asking 2 questions, but you said that we're divine minds and that we're meant to understand the universe. But then there's also points where it becomes irreducible and you have to accept that God, performed a miracle.
Right.
But, I mean, for you, do you feel like there's a point where you know when you've hit that point? Or should you just always keep asking anyways?
Oh, that's a good question. Like for instance, should we always keep looking for natural explanations? Or is there a point, like the origin of the universe and so forth, that it was just a miracle?
Right.
Again, it's the responsibility of science to push the limits as far as they go. So we've got to keep trying to find a natural explanation for the universe, to see if there's a multiverse. We have to keep seeing how far natural selection will go. Maybe it'll surprise us. So again, it's the responsibility of the scientist to push it as far as it's going to go. However, there are situations where we can use probability to say that that can't happen by chance. Like Mount Rushmore, we know can't happen by chance because of the probability. In the same way, you can look at a cell and say, probability speaking, it's not going to happen by chance. Same with the resurrection, same with the breaking of the bread.
But you can keep looking for another, physical mechanism behind that, or you can stop looking at some point.
It's fine to keep looking, but science is always a process, right? Nothing is ever set in stone. So we can say, for the moment, we can say, it sure seems like it was a miracle. But it's fine if scientists says, well, we're going to keep trying, and that's totally fine. There may be fuzzy areas, like if you pray for a person and they're healed of a sickness, it could have been miraculous, it could have been psychological, So those are fuzzy areas that we can keep exploring. But the resurrection is not fuzzy. That clearly defied what physics should have done. Origin of life is not fuzzy. In the same way, you're not going to get Mount Rushmore from wind and erosion. You're not going to get a cell from just the forces of physics. There are things we know science or physics, the physical principles cannot do. Okay? Let's see.
Ever the Christian scientific community talked about the question themselves why Jesus Christ happened in historical time in that specific period?
Great question. Right. Why did Jesus come and why was he born 4 BC in Jerusalem? Oh, I'm sorry, near Jerusalem, in Galilee. Well, again, I haven't consulted with God too much in all the details. He doesn't privy to all his plans. But again, what you see is God is into drama. He's into the unfolding of history. So his salvation plans came through history, right? Now, let's do a little guesswork though. Where's Jerusalem? Jerusalem is at the point of connection of 3 continents, right? Why at that time? Well, that's when the Romans created the Greeks created a common language. The coining a Greek as a common language. The Romans made all sorts of nice roads to take the gospel message out, right? So it's actually the perfect time in history and the perfect location for the gospel to spread. Like if Jesus came into Madagascar, it would have taken a little bit longer for the gospel to spread. So that's just speculative. Yes?
I have a question around educating students. So it's interesting to me that on your journey, you came to a point where you were educated and it turned you away from what you believe.
Right.
Do you have any ideas or theories about either how not so much prevent that from happening, but how to educate or bring up young scientists and young students who are super curious about science yet have a passion for Christ?
And I think it's really important. The danger is that many churches are afraid to expose their children to challenges. So they keep them in kind of a Christian bubble. Their friends are Christian, they watch Christian TV, they have a Christian dog, and all that sort of stuff. And then when they go to college and they meet professors that are not Christian, they've got roommates that are not Christian, they meet cats that are not Christian, all that sort of stuff. Suddenly their faith just collapses. And also it's the nature of faith. Like what happened with the Enlightenment is the Enlightenment was into objective truth. So many churches bought into that and tried to create airtight theological systems. So what happens is when you have these students with these really rigid theological systems, as soon as one piece of the system is challenged, the whole thing collapses. That's why I like the idea of mystery. We have to educate kids to recognize there's certain things we can be confident about, but there's mystery, there's uncertainty. It's great for Christians to dialogue with Christians from other traditions, to interact with kids that are atheists and agnostics and all sorts of things. But we also have to not, and again, we have this kind of this milquetoast presentation of faith, like be nice, but it is real kind of shallow. We need to give kids a robust discipleship where they really understand at a deep level the whole Christian narrative and how it applies to all of life. And then train them to engage the minds of secular people, of skeptics, in an environment where you can nurture them and teach them how to approach this. So you see the challenge is most kids grow up in church with a very superficial faith where their operating system, where their lens is essentially secular. And then when the props are removed from their parents, they just see the world in the way they've been trained to see the world, through MTV, through commercials, through Cosmopolitan magazine, all this stuff. Again, we're all part of the matrix, right? So we've got to teach kids to really understand the Christian narrative and to experience and live it out. That's another thing. Is the reason, you'll love this statistic. You'll love the statistic. The question becomes, who is the most powerful force destroying the faith of Christians?
Christians.
Because if you look statistically, many denominations, the kids who were raised in those denominations are less likely to be Christians as adults than if they're raised as atheists. Because the church is inoculating the kids with the faith. I mean, I've seen this happen. It's really interesting. Because what they're doing is they're exposed to the superficiality of faith. They hear the theology, but they don't see people raise people from the dead or heal the sick. They don't see people hear the voice of God. That's why I really appreciate Campus Harvest. I really appreciate Adam Bird and Pastor Ronnie, because they're not presenting a detached faith. They're presenting the power of God. And the kids experience that. And also, we create this, we really shoot ourselves in the foot because we create, again, this Gnostic Christianity. The idea is that in the first century there was a heresy called Gnosticism. It's the idea that the world is evil and that through receiving certain knowledge, your soul will be saved and go to heaven. Gosh, it sounds like a lot of our teaching, right? It's a heresy. The Christian message that Jesus came to save our whole being so that we're healthy, we have good relationships, we can manage our finances, we have a sense of vocational calling, we're using our gifts. We're living life to the fullest. We enjoy poetry and literature and all that stuff. And then what happens is when they go to college, they just extend that story that they're already living into their major, into their vocation, into their dormitories, so the faith is real. When you teach a kid that all Christianity is you get saved and go to heaven, it's this very anemic, detached, boring faith. So that's part of the challenge. So.
No, we'll do one more, and then I didn't realize we were going over the time, but I'm sure, Doc, are you willing to stick around a little bit? And
absolutely not.
So let's do one more.
Okay, let's see.
It's actually just saying all that, because I was,
I feel like a lot of times when I decide about God and Christ and whatnot, they totally miss the point. Like everyone knows, like the Christmas story and the resurrection story. Meanwhile, I feel like all that important stuff that happened in the middle, nobody ever talks about.
You've got to read N.T. Wright. N, I don't know what it stands for, actually. Let's say N is in Nancy, T is Tom, Wright. He talks about that in great details. What happened is the church focused on the creeds, right? I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, Jesus Christ, right? And that deals a lot with basically the resurrection and redemption, right? But the Gospels are totally different.
Yeah.
I mean, it's in there, right?
Yeah.
But the Gospels are about the transformation of society, et cetera. So what happened is the church is focused, and this is very much the Enlightenment also. It's focused on certain theological truths, but it's missed the grandeur and the beauty of the story. You're absolutely right. So N.T. Wright talks about that in great detail.
I was also thinking, like, a lot of people, it's like you just watch a 2.5-hour movie and everyone sort of talks about the last 10 minutes because, Christ spent 3 years teaching people how to live.
Right.
And then everyone's like, yeah, but what happens when you die? And so it's like, I feel like a lot of times most people lose out on sort of the parables and sort of the examples that he gave of, this is what's important. And people lose the man, sort of the politician, the philosopher, who he was, instead of replacing sort of an ideal.
You're right. And it all fits together. Because the problem is when you try to simplify Christianity, you lose a lot of the power. You can't take War and Peace and write it in like 50 pages and get away with it, right? So again, you're right. We have to go back to the Gospels and see the multifaceted beauty of the complexity of the faith. You're right. That's good. So people are welcome to come up with me afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for everything. I hope that was a meal. I was like, wow, I actually understood some of that.
Me too.
But anyways, let me just, a couple things. One, just let you know that this was all presented by Morningstar New York, and we have some information at the back at our church. We also have Pastor Josh Goodwin here and his wife Amanda that I'm going to invite to the front too. If anyone would like to pray to receive Jesus Christ tonight, we would love to make that available to you, pray with you and for you. And then lastly, Dr. Miller will be here for a little while. Just let the man get out. Sometimes we can watch the end of the Final Four tonight.
Yes. Next time, it doesn't matter. It's pointless. So
let me just preach that gospel. All right. So all I want to do is just pray real quick, and then the last thing is I need to ask, as you mingle and fellowship a little bit afterwards, we desperately need you to just be keep it down a little bit because our neighbors, it disturbs them, and we want to be good neighbors. So, Lord, thank you for this time, and just thank you for everyone coming. God, I do pray just for grace, and that you'd open hearts, and Lord, to those that may have questions, thank you, Lord, that you're big enough, Lord, to reveal yourself. And so we just thank you. We trust you in these things. Lord, refresh and renew, and give us a safe and smooth trip. We thank you. Thank you for Dr. Miller, his ministry, his wisdom. God, give him grace. Lord, lift him up and give him a platform. I thank you and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.